What's up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here. In today's video, we're going to talk about active cell transport. Unlike diffusion and osmosis, which are both examples of passive cell transport, active cell transport requires energy in order to occur. But what is energy anyway? We've used this word a lot this year in biology, and it would be worthwhile for us to formally define what exactly we mean when we say energy. Unlike matter, energy is not made of atoms. It has no mass or substance like matter does. Energy does interact with matter, though, and energy has the ability to do work and to generate movement. Energy can also be transformed from one kind of energy into another, and energy does degrade in usefulness over time, but energy cannot be destroyed, and the total amount of energy in the universe is always the same. For example, when you add heat energy to a pot of water, the molecules of water start to move faster and faster. This energy causes a phase change, turning liquid water into gaseous water, the steam that we see rising off of a pot of boiling water. When you toss a ball into the air, you are putting energy into that ball that causes it to move, and we call this energy of movement kinetic energy. As the ball moves into the air, that kinetic energy is transformed into potential energy, and the ball slows down. At its highest point, before falling back down to Earth, the ball has all potential energy and no kinetic energy. Think of this potential energy as the potential for movement. As the ball falls back down to Earth, due to gravity, that potential energy is transformed back into kinetic energy, and the ball picks up speed as it falls. When it hits the ground, that kinetic energy is transformed into different forms of energy, heat and sound. But throughout this journey, the total amount of energy remains the same. Plants transform light energy from the sun into chemical energy stored in food molecules via photosynthesis. Cellular respiration transforms this stored energy once again into another form of chemical energy that is used to power the various life processes that occur inside of cells. This usable energy comes in the form of a molecule called ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. ATP is made of an adenine molecule, a 5-carbon sugar called ribose, that's the adenosine part, and 3 phosphate groups, that's the triphosphate part. This shape should look familiar to you because ATP is essentially a nucleotide with 2 extra phosphate groups attached. Remember, nucleotides are the monomers that make up our DNA and our RNA, and all nucleotides are made of a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and one of 4 possible nitrogenous bases, of which adenine is one possibility. ATP has high potential energy, which means it has a high capacity to do work and generate movement in the cell. But this molecule is also very unstable, so once it is built, it must be used right away or it will break down. That's not really a problem because our cells use ATP for many different things, including to power our metabolism, muscle movement, and, most importantly for this video, to power active cell transport. ATP carries the energy that powers the cell, and is a little like a rechargeable battery. The low energy form of this molecule is called ADP for adenosine diphosphate, which only has 2 phosphate groups attached, and has very low potential energy as a result. Cellular respiration uses the energy stored in carbohydrates like glucose to charge up this battery, adding a 3rd phosphate group and turning ADP into ATP, which has high potential energy. Our cells use this high potential energy to do work, and high energy ATP is transformed back into low energy ADP, which can then be recharged later on. For example, cells use ATP to power the movement of particles against a concentration gradient, in the opposite direction of diffusion. Molecular transport of this kind is one example of active transport, and protein pumps found in the cell membrane use ATP to pump small molecules from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration, just the opposite of what would occur during diffusion. This occurs when our cells need to maintain a high concentration of a certain substance, in which case molecules would be pumped into the cell, or when they need to maintain a low concentration of a certain substance, in which case molecules would be pumped out of the cell. Substances like calcium, sodium, potassium, and chloride are often transported into and out of our cells in this manner. This kind of active transport happens in our nerve cells all the time and is a huge part of how our nervous system sends electrical signals around the body in order to generate movement in our muscles. Certain large molecules that are too big to fit through the channels and pumps embedded in our cell membrane are transported in a different way, one which also requires an input of energy in order to occur. This is called bulk transport, and this is how large protein molecules are transported into and out of our cells. It is important not to get confused here because the pumps and channels that are embedded in our cell membranes are made of proteins, but they do not transport proteins. These protein pumps and protein channels are only able to transport much smaller molecules. A protein molecule is way too big to be transported by a protein pump, and it is way too big to fit through any protein channels. Here we can see how a large molecule like a protein is transported across a cell membrane. In both cases, the large molecule is packaged into a structure called a vesicle, which is surrounded by a membrane of its own. Because this vesicle is surrounded by a membrane, and because this membrane is made of the same kinds of lipid molecules that make up our cell membrane, it is able to fuse with the cell membrane in order to push this large molecule out of the cell, as we see here. And this is called exocytosis, which you can remember by thinking of it as exit cytosis. The opposite process occurs when a cell needs to bring in a large molecule. In this case, the molecule pushes into the cell membrane, forming a small pocket. This pocket detaches from the cell membrane, forming a completely enclosed vesicle inside of the cell. This vesicle can be broken down by a lysosome once inside of the cell, allowing the molecule to be released into the cytoplasm of the cell. This is called endocytosis, which you can remember if you think of this as into cytosis. Both of these processes require energy in order to occur, unlike diffusion and osmosis, which occur without any additional input of energy at all. Endocytosis is also how single-celled eukaryotes like the amoeba take in food. Here we can see a picture of an amoeba extending itself around a bacterium, kind of like this vesicle forming around this molecule in this figure. For our amoeba, these two parts of the cytoplasm will fuse, and the amoeba will take the bacterium inside, where it can be broken down, and its molecules metabolized for energy. Active and passive cell transport help us to maintain homeostasis by allowing our cells to take in certain materials that they need, and to get rid of materials that they don't. Passive cell transport via diffusion and osmosis requires no energy. But there are plenty of times when the cell needs a high or low concentration of a substance, and in these cases, a balance just won't do. The cell must use active transport, which requires an input of energy, to pump materials against the direction of diffusion. And this process requires a significant portion of our cell's daily energy. This energy is provided in the form of ATP, the rechargeable battery of the cell. And with that, I will bring our video to a close. Thanks again for watching, and remember that you can go back and watch this video as many times as you need until you feel like you understand the concepts.